Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's roundtable discussion on cannabis and youth prevention, hosted by the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, but from now on, I'll be calling it CPEAR. My name is Andrew Freedman. I serve as the Executive Director of CPEAR. The coalition is comprised of members that represent regulated industries, academics, think tanks, public safety officials, medical and mental health professionals, financial services firm, and social equity organizations, all of whom work together to develop policy and build a national conversation on the federal regulation of cannabis. Put simply, cannabis reform is here. CPEAR exists to get it right. Although state cannabis legalization is already underway, a federal framework to regulate and understand the effects of cannabis is absent. Today, over 100 million Americans live in a state with access to legalized adult use cannabis, but what does that mean for America's youth? This week, we published our latest public policy paper entitled Addressing Youth and Cannabis, Solutions to Combat and Prevent Youth Misuse Through a Federal Regulatory System. If you have not read it already, I urge you to go and read it, but wait until after the panel. This paper explains youth misuse in the evolving federal cannabis regulation debate, offers solutions within a proposed federal regulatory system. CPEAR believes efforts to reduce youth misuse youth use and misuse of cannabis should be driven by local communities, with the federal government oversight and data driving the conversation. During today's panel, you'll hear from youth safety stakeholders on their efforts to combat youth misuse and how we can use findings from CPEAR's paper and turn them into useful tactics. Later in the webinar, you'll be hearing from Senator Hickenlooper, my former boss, about his role in the Colorado rollout and what he believes needs to happen for youth use. But for now, you are joined by our distinguished panel, who's going to be discussing the paper. As we've said, we believe that this is a conversation between the local communities, the states, and the federal government at an effort to reduce youth use and misuse of cannabis. A federal regulatory system should consist of policies to fund community systems and ensure that appropriate resources are available. Finally, a community approach must be driven by data and science to adapt continuously. Implementing federal cannabis regulation will require a comprehensive approach to account for externalities resulting from widespread access, the most important of which is its impact on youth and the availability of resources to combat any avenues for misuse by this segment of the US population. This policy area is critical as only adults over 21 should consume cannabis, except for treatments proven by clinical trials and a licensed physician to help kids with obvious needs for cannabis as a treatment. So I'm pleased to introduce our panel for today's discussion. First, we have Brandy Axtell, Senior Vice President and author of she's at responsibility.org. Brandy began her career at the National Office of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, where she managed policy efforts, opened MADD's first Washington, D.C. office, and directed advocacy efforts for the National .08 VAC law and many other state laws. At responsibility.org, she manages all policy, government relations, and traffic safety efforts and is responsible for relationships across the political spectrum, including members of Congress, state attorney generals, governors, and various local and federal level agencies. Brandy oversees the development of organizational policies and works collaboratively with partners to ensure effective policy implementation. Brandy, as always, thanks for being a friend, and it's an honor to have you. Next, we have Rick Burt. If you have not checked out Rick Burt's SAD TikTok, it is time for you to subscribe and to like. He's the president and CEO of Students Against Destructive Decisions, or SAD. A SAD alumna himself, Rick brings over a decade of prevention experience to his role and is considered an expert in the matters of youth, health, and safety by his peers. Rick is responsible for leading the organizational programming, outreach, development, and communications efforts while leading SAD's national staff. He has authored several publications and featured SAD's unique form of peer-to-peer approach that is vital to creating lasting behavioral change in youth. Rick, thanks so much for joining us as well. Finally, I'm pleased to introduce Susan Stanton. Unfortunately, I do not know about Susan's social media presence or whether she has a TikTok account, but she's the network lead of Illinois' After School Network. In her role, Susan is responsible for leading the work of the coalition, including advocating for the organization's work with policymakers at various levels, implementing quality improvement initiatives, and representing the coalition in several nationwide and statewide bodies. Susan is a former educator, having served at Teach for America. Susan, finally, pleasure to have you. And with that, hopefully you'll hear a lot less of me going forward. We're going to start with you, Susan. In CPEAR's policy paper, we recommend allocating a significant portion of state cannabis tax revenue to youth prevention. including after-school programs and positive youth development programs. Can you tell us about the tactics the Illinois After-School Network has taken around youth prevention?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. ACT Now is the statewide after-school network for Illinois, and so we work with over 2,000 programs throughout the state. We're also the part of the 50-state after-school network, and so we have a counterpart in all 50 states with organizations doing this work. The after-school programs that we serve help to promote protective factors that reduce negative outcomes for youth in the long term. So after-school programs do this by things like connecting youth to positive adult mentors consistently, helping youth to learn how to conduct conflict resolution and teaching that explicitly, and also creating supportive environments. There's often not time in the standards-driven school day in order to be able to provide this explicit instruction and develop SEL or social emotional learning competencies. So we support this in after school programs by providing social emotional learning training for the adults who work in them, as well as access to SEL curriculum. We also do a lot of training on trauma-informed care best practices to really help get to the root causes that cause youth to make choices that might lead to negative long-term outcomes.
One of the lessons we learned early on in Colorado, and I'm wondering if you found it's the same there, is it was less about positive youth development programs were less about saying like cannabis is bad in this way and that way, and more about helping kids realize their potential and start to envision what issues they want in their life. Is that the sort of theory that you guys move forward with, and have you seen it successful in Illinois?
Definitely. It's more about giving youth the tools they need in order to make smart choices and to lead healthy and successful lives. So it's about exposing them to things like the arts or STEM careers, and in providing engaging programming or connections to their mentors and their peers. If they have these enriching, fun experiences in the out of school time space, then they're driven to reach their career goals and to also make healthy choices moving forward. And they have support in having to work through those things during their, elementary school, middle school, and then high school years as well. So it's really about providing those positive, enriching experiences and then giving them the tools that they need to lead healthy and successful lives.
Mm-hmm. I have really enjoyed seeing the evolution of prevention campaigns being less kind of this hammer and nail of here's something that's scary and you should stick around to a much more positive messaging. And it appears that from the data that is both in the paper and that we get directly from you guys, that it's working. So that's a heartening place to be going to. Rick, going to CPEAR's recommendations, we encourage states to set and promote safe, healthy choices and how that can relate. Can you talk to us about how SAD's work promoting safe and healthy choices and how that could relate to cannabis?
Yeah, first of all, Andrew, thanks for having me. It's such an honor to be with such an esteemed panel today and really appreciate the work of CPEAR in this space. We've seen that this is really about setting both environmental and peer-to-peer factors in place to help young people make informed decisions. As Susan said, we're in the midst of a cultural conversation around this topic of cannabis. And unfortunately, in the middle are youth who are trying to make sense of messaging that they're getting from the left, right, middle, and everywhere in between. So what we have found to be most helpful is to start with our approach, which is really to first empower young people with the knowledge and resources they need to help themselves and their friends make positive choices. And secondly, engage parents and other adult allies in the conversation as well. Oftentimes, adults are looking for trusted resources of how to have conversations about cannabis, about how to have a meaningful conversation with their teen, and about how to continue to support this idea that under 21, we all agree that that is not an appropriate place for young people to be engaging in this behavior. So we just try to start with messaging that's real, authentic, and positive, because we know the idea of just say no is not only antiquated and doesn't work, but really isn't where youth are today. You joke about TikTok, but we understand that even though I may look ridiculous doing TikToks, it's also where young people are, and really effective way to not only communicate with them and the platform that they're doing, but also with the messaging that makes sense. And finally, we believe in mobilizing the community, engaging other key stakeholders that are so essential to developing not only youth individually, but also collectively, to where adult allies at the community level that are also engaged in areas of engaging youth, whether that be in school or outside of school, whether that be at home or outside of the home, are a part of the conversation as well. It really does take a village to raise a child, and I think it will take a village to modernize this message in a way that will really help us keep young people safe.
we did start a responsible adult campaign, or a trusted adult
Mhm.
campaign in Colorado, but we were pretty late in the game on doing that. It's one of those things
Yeah.
that I wish, there's all these lessons learned. We
Mhm.
had kind of a failed first messaging campaign in Colorado, before we kind of heard from the experts and got it right. And then, a lot of the tools that we ended up bringing on just took a little bit of time to get.
Mhm.
We have questions in the chat for us to post the report. It is on our website at www.cpear.org. I don't know if we have the ability to post it, but please go to our website, and it is up and there under publications. Randy, responsibility.org has done a great work around underage alcohol consumption and impaired driving. Is your organization looking into the effects of cannabis and preventing youth impaired drivers from getting behind the wheel?
Thanks, Andrew. It's like Rick said, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to work with all of you. I would say yes, absolutely. So one of the things that we have found is working on the issue of underage drinking prevention. It's something you have to start with kids when they're like 4 or 5, and you have to continue that conversation. As Rick said, everyone needs to be having these conversations with kids through their lifespan. One of the programs that we launched is Ask, Listen, Learn, Kids and Alcohol Don't Mix. We worked really hard to be able to make it the most widely distributed program of its kind, and to make it one that fits into STEM classes, health classes. We had resounding requests to implement a cannabis module, because teachers really needed to teach this at the same time as they were teaching about alcohol. Really, really important. So what we did was we went out and we make this a resource available for free for everyone. And you can find it at asklistenlearn.com or .org. But it is really important to talk to kids early, before they have that first peer pressure exposure, so that they know what to say and why. And one of, I think, in drawing from underage drinking prevention, one of the most compelling messages that you can send to kids and adults is brain development, and how important it is to delay that first use. It not only postpones the risk of cannabis use disorder, but it also develops the brain in a more healthy way. And that has been a compelling message. On the impaired driving side of things, we established the National Alliance to Stop Impaired Driving, or NACID, and SAD is a member. Anybody's welcome to join, but we are really tackling multiple substance impaired driving, which unfortunately happens a lot lately. One of my big concerns, and one of the things that NACID will be focusing on, and we'll be working with SAD on that front, is, when they get to the teenage years, they need to understand that it causes impaired driving, and they need to know not to drive while impaired. And even though we send strong 21 messages, don't start until at least after 21, we have to be prepared to really talk to them and reach them in a way that they will listen about the risks of impaired driving. So that's something that we are working on in real time. Oh, you're on mute, Andrew.
It's not a webinar unless there's a moment where one of us is on mute. I try to take that away. You guys now can't do it because I beat you to it. We've been, part of our report, and I think some of the more surprising news, especially when we were in Colorado, and we were kind of the first in the nation to go this. We expected to see this huge increase in youth use, and in fact we didn't after legalization. I think much to our Senator Hickenlooper and my surprise. There are some. I'm not saying everything headed in a great direction. Some of those who are using more now. But we have seen, even in some states, a little bit of a decrease in youth use post legalization, especially when you look at the monthly use metric. Are you seeing the same thing in alcohol recently? Are you seeing a positive trend in youth alcohol use and driving? And if so, what do you attribute that to?
So we have seen a decline over the last 15 years or so. We have seen that decline. And I don't know if Rick was surprised, but we were surprised to see it reach an all-time low during COVID. I mean, on the traffic safety side, we saw traffic deaths soar So we didn't really know what to expect with underage drinking. So, I mean, I think it's going to be really important taking a look at those statistics coming out of the pandemic. Were they reaching all-time lows because they were home? I think that remains to be seen. But the good news here is that we are not seeing an increase. We are seeing a decrease in both. And so we have to work really hard to keep that moving in the right direction. The other thing that the paper showed that I think, we really have to focus in on is we do know that the harms are going up among the people who are underage and using it. And there's some really hefty risks there. And so while, overall use is down and that's great, I think, we really need to do some research and some action to really focus on those people, because all of this is happening in the midst of a mental health crisis, and we have to really be looking at all of these issues comprehensively and not in silos. I think that's a really important point moving forward.
The term has been mentioned already today, but it is not one that I think is as popularized and probably needs to be as the term cannabis use disorder, which really talks more about problematic use of cannabis rather than infrequent use. And obviously, when we talk about youth, we want no use under the age of 21. But in particular, we want to make sure that we are not gearing people up to have cannabis use disorder, which can stick with you for your entire life and be very detrimental to a positive life. And I think you're right. I think we need to start being able to shift the conversation, not only making sure as few kids use under the age of 21 as possible, but that those who are using don't become more and more problematic users. I think is going to be as equally as a part of the conversation. Susan, most of after school, at least our understanding of most of after school programming is that you really are trying your hardest to work through the communities themselves. And so much of this is a community driven process. Can you talk about how your organization tries to work with the communities to activate empirically proven programs that work?
Sure. And that is part of the great part about after school programs, is that they're really a locally driven solution to local issues. And so you're able to craft programs that really are meeting the needs of your community if you're in an urban environment or a rural environment, and then also able to address the issues that those specific families face. So one of the things that's really helpful with our organization and with statewide after school networks is this power of the network, that when you have these locally driven solutions, you really do need this intermediary to help make those connections to the local areas and to know where people are. So we work with programs all over the state to provide this high quality professional development and access to curricula. We then build their capacity to offer these high quality programs, which lead to positive youth outcomes. So when needs are identified by either policymakers or school districts, they're able to come to us, and then we can work to connect them with the local organizations in their area doing this work. So it's really helpful when these systems don't always speak to one another to have kind of this intermediary role and to make those connections. And then these programs at the local area, like I said, can help to promote these protective factors and really assess the needs of that specific community, of those youth, and then craft their programming to really address those needs. In Illinois, for example, when cannabis was legalized, the state created a grant program to reinvest in at-risk communities. And then the funding from this program goes to youth development programs to conduct activities to, again, promote those local solutions. So far, we've seen programs use this funding for things like math enrichment, because the school district showed that 50% of third graders were failing math. We have seen them use it for things like college and career readiness, when communities saw a need for teenagers to have to find assistance finding summer jobs, creating resumes, and things of that nature. We've also seen communities create arts education programming and art centers, because that was lacking in the community. By helping youth to find their passions and make good choices, it leads them to lead healthy and fulfilled lives long term.
So part of our paper kind of envisions the networking and connecting that you're doing and activation that you're doing, that there's a role for at the federal level for kind of your guys and say the Colorado After School Alliance and a number of all these organizations to have kind of a connective tissue place to tap into, to be able to say, here's the data we're getting, here's what we're finding is working and not working, and then moreover, here's cannabis tax revenue that could be funneled into programs that work, and make sure we supercharge those programs. On a conceptual level, and no one here is supposed to weigh in on whether or not they're pro legalization. That's not the discussion, but on a conceptual level, is that something that you ultimately think would be very helpful to your mission and the mission of the communities that you work with?
Definitely. And we've seen this already in our state, in Illinois, that by tapping into the power of networks and these intermediaries, it gives you the flexibility that you need to really craft those solutions that are specific to the communities that you're serving and to the youth that you're serving as well, too. It's also an efficient way to run these programs and to get funding out to organizations. And we've also seen that cannabis legalization allowed us that funding to then reinvest in communities that needed it most.
Brandy, if you're talking, you're on mute. We have two.
Sorry about that. I would say that while responsibility.org takes no position on legalization, I can tell you that from an underage drinking prevention perspective, what worked really well was about 15 years ago, Congress passed a law called the STOP Act, which brought all of the federal agencies that touched underage drinking in any way, brought them all together for a collaborative approach. And that really built a structure that really brought all of the efforts together, eliminated duplication, and really one other important point, brought every single stakeholder to the table. And until that point, I think a lot of people had been left on the sidelines, and notably people that were associated in any way with the alcohol industry. I think that cohesive effort has led to some of the gains that we've seen over the last 15 years. And I think one thing that makes a lot of sense is to tackle it together with all stakeholders at the table. Everybody has a role to play. And so I think, the mindset that certain groups shouldn't be in the mix here, I think that's a bad message. And it's, I think, a national effort aimed at this that filters down to the states and funds communities. I mean, we've seen that works before.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Brandy. There's a proverb that we toss around in the office that if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I know many folks have heard that, but I think we've learned some lessons from the discourse we've had around, say, alcohol or other substances, where you're right, where we have segmented certain stakeholder groups and labeled them as mischievous or whatnot. And I really applaud CPEAR's approach of bringing everyone around the same table. Certainly, there are enough mistakes to make that we don't need to make the same ones again. And so I think, Andrew's point and mantra of getting it right is absolutely key. And I think getting it right, to Andrew's earlier point, also starts with working with the next generation. There certainly are a number of challenges that exist with adult populations. And I'm so thankful every day that I work with youth and not adults, because adults are messy. But young people, really are seeking clarity, and I think seeking an authentic, informed opinion on this topic, because there has been so much noise at every level, local, state, and federal. So I think that's an important point that you make about bringing everyone together under one tent, if you will, to have these conversations.
That was awesome. I would let you guys talk forever. I will introduce a new question into the group. Probably what drives headlines the most, and we've mentioned it a couple of times here, is the databases that we have right now, and and what we have, which is mainly past month use of cannabis. We have seen the surprise, and I think it has driven a lot of headlines, that there hasn't been an increase in youth use. Most studies would say, and most meta studies would say, there hasn't been an increase or notable increase, and in some places, and even a decrease in youth use that have gone through adult use or medical legalization states that have gone through it. First of all, does this track with your guys' research? I know that you guys are in the field in so many other different ways. Does it track with what you're seeing? And in general, what do you think you're seeing with youth right now? Where is the conversation with youth, and where should we be focused to make sure that everything is better in the future?
I can take a stab at that one first, Andrew. Again, we're very lucky to have about 8,000 chapters in middle schools, high schools, and colleges across the country. And so, obviously our members are youth. And some of the things that, we hear is that when we talk about cannabis, it's a far more complex subject than, say, alcohol. where how it's consumed, when it's consumed, really is what youth are seeking some clarity on. And I think we, the prevention community, have really done a poor job of having that conversation. Again, we've begun and end the conversation with that cannabis is bad. And I think we need to take a step further to begin to educate youth so that they can be informed on the science of what's happening. As I think all three of you have said at some point, brain development is a key part of this equation, and establishing a healthy relationship with all of the elements in our environment are so key. I think what we also find is when we take the taboo off of a subject and we normalize it, we begin to see a more informed youth approach to this. We continue to support those guardrails on elements of any form of legalization, because it's so important that young people, are entering a world where things are regulated. It's not a free-for-all, if you will. And I appreciate CPEAR's approach to that as well. So, it doesn't necessarily surprise me, because again, we've normalized something, if you will, that then has those healthy guardrails in place far more than, say, a black market approach or other pieces which allow for more informed access and more controlled access as well.
One thing I think would be very interesting to see, and this is a call out to our last paper, which Dr. Gruber from Harvard Medical School was on, is cannabis is not one thing, and we're learning that more and more all the time, and it screws up our research, because we're like, does cannabis do X or does it do Y? Well, some cannabis might do X and some cannabis might do Y. Complicate, I'm as guilty about it as anybody. I use the shorthand cannabis because we have to talk about it. But if we could start to refine our language to have a more accurate talk about what responsible use or harmful use might look like, and what is more harmful, that could be very helpful in the education. Love that.
And one quick follow-up to that, I think it also goes back to educating parents and other adult allies, because the cannabis of their youth is not the cannabis that we're working with today, how it's produced, manufactured, grown. So I think also modernizing that conversation is really important, so that the conversations that are happening at home, on the way to soccer practice, in church youth groups are far more relevant to the youth of today than an antiquated approach that's, again, from a day gone and by.
And just adding to that, I just want to say, I think that is so important. I'm reading a book now called Decoding Boys. I have a 13-year-old. And one of the things it says is, the biggest mistake you can make is to not talk to them. They act like they don't want to talk to you, but you have to talk to them. And so knowing how to have that conversation and knowing how to have it in the right way about so many different issues, cannabis among them, is going to be really key. Kids, we know this from tons of research on underage drinking. Even when they don't act like they're listening to you, they're listening, and they don't want to disappoint you. And so parents are a really important messenger. And if not a parent, then a trusted adult. And we really have to approach this as a community issue to educate kids, educate them the right way. And in order to do that, we have to educate ourselves.
Susan, I know that you also have incredible reach into a community, into a state that's also going through adult use. What have you seen from a data side of what's happening in the community post legalization?
It's still really hard to tell, because it's so recent for us here in Illinois, and I think a lot of what we've seen has been mostly anecdotal so far. But in this initial phase, I think what's been really great is the fact that we've, outside of, the legalization question was answered, and then we kind of really embraced what was next from that. And they really leaned into this idea of, if this is the state that we're living in, and if this is the context, then let's choose empowerment and empower communities through additional funding, empower youth by creating these positive experiences. And so really just glad to see that our prevention strategies have really been rooted in the idea of empowering these communities and these youth.
One of the last questions before we get to some of the audience Q&A, and please continue to send audience Q&A through the Q&A function here. We can see that on our back end. is about public education campaigns. Obviously, I think want to talk directly to youth. It sounds like we want to talk to trusted messengers such as parents and educators. I would say I know firsthand it's really hard to run public education campaigns, and you can really step in it really quickly. I think under a different world, I would just run you through the Don't Be a Lab Rat campaign and how many sleepless nights we had when we launched our first campaign in Colorado. Starting with Rick, but I'm interested in hearing from everybody. What lessons have we learned about youth messaging and messaging in general that should be viewed upon the federal side to make sure that, in my opinion, no one is least trustworthy to talk about cannabis to youth than the federal government. So like we've lost all credibility to talk about it on the federal side. And yet it's hearing from you guys, it's so important that we do find those messages that work both for youth and for trusted messengers. So how do we start to repair the credibility gap that exists there? And I'm not saying like the federal government should write the campaigns, but what lessons should we have coming into it, and how can federal scientists and federal government become more trusted with their voice here?
I love our federal government partners, but they should definitely not write the campaign. We need authentic youth voices to be leading that charge. And so obviously I'm biased, but again, we continue to believe that peer-to-peer education is that foundational piece with messaging from adults and other caring allies that support that youth-driven message. Because again, we know in the moment of decision of when, as Brandy said, delaying that first use or preventing that dangerous behavior from happening, I think that's so key to have that youth voice be empowered and engaged to be able to speak up. So real, authentic, positive, all of these things are things that we've learned from the traffic safety community. And speaking of the traffic safety community, I think it's also important that we coordinate from the different perspectives of which youth are hearing this message. So working between public health, mental health, mobility, safety, and really coming together with a broad perspective. Really appreciate the work of the California Office of Traffic Safety, who's allowed us to do just that, to work collectively in addressing this drug driving issue, but also, as Brandy said, from a polysubstance issue, which is really important. I think to make sure that we're doing it in a way, as we've already joked, that's authentic. So again, doing TikToks, thinking about social media, also moving beyond the norms of, again, what we've done with campaigns from the 80s and 90s. Those are not the youth of today. So being relevant, being consistent in that message, stepping out of our comfort zones and thinking about from a youth perspective, all of those are key lessons that we've learned.
Amazing. Anything from Susan or Brandy on what we should be thinking about as we begin messaging here?
I think one thing we've learned from underage drinking prevention is that fear-based campaigns don't really work. So I think that positive messaging is one thing to focus on, and then also focusing on health and giving a true message. That what we've seen is that young people will reject that messaging if they don't feel it's authentic, to Rick's point. And so that's really important. And the other thing I would say is that if it's just a public education campaign, it's not going to be as successful. It needs to be integrated into all the other efforts in the community, including enforcement, including after school programs. And that's really important. Often, you just kick off a public education campaign. That's just not going to be as powerful as a collaborative effort.
Yeah, just to build off of that, I'd say that, when it comes to prevention, a public campaign is one aspect of it, but really to get to this idea of prevention, it's about holistic supports and supporting kind of the whole needs of youth and their families. And I think that that's a really key piece. But I also love what Rick said about, empowering youth voice. And I think Brandy mentioned earlier, starting young. And I think that those are also really key aspects.
Can I add one more thing, Andrew? Apologies, but I think this is so important too, that with an issue like cannabis education, where we still have so much to learn, and not only about the substance, but also how we message it, let's not sacrifice the good in pursuit of the great. And by that, I mean, I know we all love those evidence-based strategies, but it's going to take us a little bit of a while to gain that knowledge base and that body of evidence. So let's not be so holding true to that stamp of evidence-based that we sacrifice using evidence-informed and promising practices in pursuit of that body of research to prove that we know what's working. I know in the peer-to-peer space, sometimes it's hard to quantify, that outreach. And so sometimes that scares our researching friends from, if you can't measure it, it didn't happen. And that's not true in this case. So I think that's an important point to make too.
In the cannabis space, it's so important because I think there's this hope that we could somehow have 100% perfect vision into every issue, into all of the science. But the truth has to become, first of all, the newsflash of like cannabis is already here in every state, and it's not going away. We need policies that work today, but that can be reiterated and work as new data comes in so that we can make new decisions going down the road. I love that point that in some places we just have to make the best educated guess of what's going to work for a little bit, and then we have to go check it, and then we have to continue to iterate a better and better system. I also love the point that there's no campaign out there that is by itself going to decrease youth use, that it has to be coupled with a holistic and different policy levers, and particularly working with communities to empower them to really reach into these world. Moving on to audience Q&A for the group. You mentioned youth use either decreases or remains flat in regulated cannabis markets. Is there spillover in regions bordering legal states? I'm not sure we know if we have an answer to this question, but have you guys seen positive or negative effects, or in this way, negative effects in neighboring illicit states? Brandy, you're muted.
Sorry. In terms of underage consumption, I mean, I would probably defer to Rick for that question, but if for impaired driving, I think we have seen, that you have seen some spillover into some states there. So, where that intersects with teens, I think that's important to keep an eye on, but defer to Rick on the other issue.
Yeah, we have, because I think we have to remember that no one's life exists just purely in a geographic defined space, right? So when a community on the border is facing a new challenge or a new policy change, that obviously is going to spill over into other areas. So absolutely, I think about states that you can speak to probably better than I, Andrew, but states like Wyoming have certainly seen this as legalization has come to town. And so I think this is especially important, whereas I was mentioning a moment ago, we marry those issues of substance use with also mobility safety and talking about traffic safety so that there's consistency across the board. And this is where I really call upon our federal policymakers and our federal partners to help us create that consistency. Regardless of your state's legalization status, we can all agree that no one under the age of 21 should be using the substance. So I say, instead of being nervous about wading into the conversation, let's start with the common ground of talking about messaging, particularly in the impaired driving space, of tackling this issue so that regardless of this one state's policy versus another, we're tackling the underlying public health issue, and we're saving lives and making a difference, particularly in those communities that are, again, feet away from each other, but facing the same challenges.
I do think, and it's a great point to bring up on the back end, is that, the problem with a simple, just blanket prohibition statement from the federal government is it doesn't allow us to delve into the nuances like youth use. And these are conversations that essentially, there's like this on the federal government side because they don't want to talk about any use. And so it's really hard to prioritize both responsible use and not allowing anybody under the age of 21 to misuse when you can't talk about it at all. So I think a great point, and probably we need more permission for more senators and Congress people to be able to talk about cannabis youth use and what can be done to prevent it without having to go and talk about all of legalization all at the same time. For the group, what role, if any, does marketing and advertising play in youth consumption? Does this contribute to accidental consumption of edibles?
I think that responsible advertising is going to be key moving forward here. There's a lot of lessons you can learn from the alcohol space, and there needs to be some restrictions associated with advertising. I'm thinking in particular of potency and edibles, and making sure that this does not appeal to children. If the law is 21, then the marketing shouldn't be appealing to kids. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there for the industry to really take charge and be responsible on that front.
I couldn't agree more. We have been strong advocates for working and partnering with the alcohol industry in this same space, and I think it's so important that we learn from those lessons of making sure that we are. I'm not even going to say not marketing to youth, that we're anti-marketing to youth. Taking that extra next step to show some leadership in this space, and I do call upon the industry to do that because I think that's so important. And even to think about the chemical compounds and the flavors and the way products are consumed, just to make sure that those are not especially enticing to youth. And again, to also make sure on the state side that there are guardrails, there's regulations, there's ID checks, all those things that come in enforcement that we've learned that are so important to make sure that we're not only reducing the marketing side, but we're also training those who are marketing and at the point of sale to make sure that we're reducing youth access is key too.
I will just say from our end, lessons learned from Colorado when we first launched the edibles market, which I think the edibles was not a thing that was, really all that widely known amongst people who were not regular cannabis users. We had very few restrictions on it. And then very quickly we wrote in within like the next years, like can't look like an animal, can't look like a person, can't look like a cartoon, can't look like a fruit. And that to me, like that shows the kind of level of low hanging fruit that there is here. Like, of course it shouldn't look like those things in edible form, but is all the much more reason that I think the sort of deeper lessons we've learned from regulated industry already about what are responsible products and not responsible products. How do we not repeat the mistakes we've made in the consumer packaged goods world, and instead start at a place with products that are not excessively attractive to youth.
And one more thing I would add to that, Andrew, also being mindful of consumer education as part of that marketing. So that way, when you've got the peach O-rings that are in the bag, that those aren't mistaken by a kiddo or even younger audience for accidental consumption. I know that's something that we've certainly talked with CPEAR and member organizations about, because that's so important that accidental consumption is a real factor. And I think that goes back to marketing, but also consumer education as part of the conversation too.
We're going to end with concluding thoughts on this. This has been, I would talk to you guys for like 5 hours, but why should, or you can disagree with this altogether, but why should Congress consider a federal framework conversation for cannabis regulation, particularly when it comes to youth use? And do you see this as an imminent need? Also, feel free to just weigh in with any last thoughts you have for the group.
I would like to say, in terms of legalization at the federal level, I can't weigh in on that front, but I can say, watching the states as they have considered legalization, it is so important to put youth consumption and impaired driving at the forefront of planning when looking at this issue. And often it's an afterthought. And when it's an afterthought, it's a problem. And so as states are looking to legalize, they have to put that as a top priority, and building those guardrails and making sure that they're building an infrastructure that will prevent youth consumption, that will prevent impaired driving. And I think that should be the top priority for any state, and also Congress as they're looking at this issue.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Brandy. And to me, the conversation about legalization is one that's passed because it's here. And whether we have states that have legalized or not, we're still dealing with the youth access component. And as Brandy said very well, it is often an afterthought, and that needs to stop today. We need to reshift this to be a national priority, because there are so many unintended consequences and so many things that are impacting our communities, and our youth are oftentimes left to bear the brunt of those unforeseen challenges. So again, I would challenge our federal partners to make this a priority, because again, regardless of where you are in the country, that 21 and under threshold is safe ground for us all. Let's start with that and make that a priority, so that we're building a more informed, more responsible, dare I say, healthier next generation that can start by making more informed decisions. So absolutely, and appreciate you, Andrew, moderating and the opportunity to be here with this esteemed panel.
And I agree. I think that we're clearly seeing legalization all throughout the country. And I just applaud CPEAR's inclusion of partnerships with after-school programs in its report, because what we've seen throughout the state is that many of these states that have chosen legalization have simultaneously had partnerships or investments in after-school programs at the same time. And I think that the federal government can learn from lessons like that. I know my colleagues at the After School Alliance just did a deep dive into a variety of different states that legalized and how they invested in after-school programs simultaneously. And we're seeing that as a really promising practice to really help promote those protective factors to prevent drug misuse. And I think that the federal government can certainly learn lessons from these successful practices so far.
I cannot thank you guys enough. Thank you for a wonderful panel. We are moving on to the part 2 of 3 of what is. So I will bid adieu to you guys and bring on Gray Taylor. So thank you and have a great rest of your day. Another part of the legalization and perhaps ends great with the last message is talking about a regulated point of sale in a place where you can keep purchases to 21 and up. With that, I'd like to welcome Gray Taylor, who's the Executive Director of Connexus, a nonprofit technology organization dedicated to the development and implementation of standards, technology, innovation, and advocacy for the convenience store and retail fueling market. Gray, I know that you guys have been kind of working on this and kind of what the most recent technologies can be. Do you want to tell us about TruAge and why it was developed and how it fits in today's conversation about cannabis and youth prevention?
Yeah, first, Andrew, I'd like to say I agree with everything I heard today. I have 5 teenagers, and I'm married to a licensed family therapist. And so all this messaging really resonated. It's going to take a lot of education. My job is to make sure that there is zero access. That's really my objective with TruAge. So 2 years ago, I was asked by the executive committee at NACS, because we sell 90% of the nicotine, 37% of the beer, and we sell a lot of liquor, and we sell other things that are age regulated, such as dextromethorphan. If you go through the whole list of things that you get carded for, if you go to Home Depot and buy spray paint, you get age verified. And so what we came to the conclusion on is that first of all, the technology is caught up to the point where we can digitally authenticate IDs presented to verify age. But that brought another problem up, which is how do we make sure that privacy is preserved at the point of sale as well, which is going to be a key topic going forward. You know, right now in Washington, D.C., big argument over how much privacy you have when you're online and you're doing anything online. And so we came up with a system for TruAge, which relies on the World Wide Web Consortium standards and standards being adopted by the Department of Homeland Security Silicon Valley Innovation Program. We work in lockstep with them, and it relies on distributed verifiable credentials. What we, in essence, are doing is creating a free system to adopt, a free system to operate that digitally authenticates every ID that is presented. The most important thing is this: if you think about in terms of the cashiers, in my industry, we have over 2 million people working the front ends. How do you train them to be very disciplined in their age verification? We decided to take it off the table. So the system basically enforces age verification. In the case of Juul, if you buy Juul pods, as an example, it's 100% age verification. I got white hair, they'll verify me, and the POS will not continue until that's done. So we take that burden off of the cashier, first and foremost. Secondly, then, we actually can compare that back to a centralized database, which is pseudonymized. That solves another problem of youth access, which is social selling. Somebody brought up the adjacent state problem. I live in Texas. My kids go to high school, 2 go to college. What's shown up in the high schools now is not just the bud weed, but what's shown up is professionally created vape juice that's being used in vaporized pens. What we think is that kids are going, the older brothers are going to Colorado. They're buying and going into multiple stores on these trips, coming back, and then that's what's getting sold into the high schools. And so social selling is an issue. So we have the ability in TruAge to do systemic limitation so that regardless of where I go, if I'm only allowed to buy X amount of a product over a certain period of time, that system will keep the open to buy on track so that the social sellers just can't go out and start shopping store to store to store. And again, this is all free and it's being paid for by the FMCGs, the consumer packaged goods companies, who are very concerned about underage availability. So we've got Anheuser-Busch, InBev, we've got Molson Coors, we have Altria, we have Reynolds Tobacco, we have Juul. We're going to be talking to everybody who sells a product that's legal to help us get it out into the broad market, not just convenience, so that we can close off the underage availability. And then the last thing we have, and if you talk to any university, state university, student life dean, underage fakes. I would submit that 80% of the underage availability today is because of fakes. If you go to my son's school, College Station, 55,000 students, you can't spit without hitting a very good fake ID. And so we want to work with the states, the DMVs within the states, to get simply a valid ID message on our first scan. And then we can literally cut out these fake IDs so that kids can't come in with a good fake and just legally buy. So it's a very comprehensive program. It's going to take us many years to do it. But we felt, and we know now, that once we consolidated this to a singular standard that's available to any POS company to adopt and any retailer to put at their front end, we can do this for less than the cost, for less than $10 million a year as a nonprofit organization. And the extensibility is amazing, because as we move more and more to online purchases, the way that the system is set up is that we can now validate somebody who's remotely purchasing an alcohol or tobacco or even cannabis product. And then we can also re-verify upon point of delivery, which is a very key point. We follow the PACT Act in that regards. You should validate at point of sale. You should validate at point of delivery. In a retail environment, it happens at the same time, but in a remote environment, it doesn't. This also becomes extensible in that these tokens, this identity, can also float with you so that, and we've talked to Google about this, Google will not present you with an inappropriate advertisement. If your token says that you are under the age of 21, you won't see an alcohol ad, you won't see an ad for tobacco or Juul. And then you can extend that even further to online. TikTok was mentioned. This is a great tool for us to now validate these artificial intelligence engines that are driving kids on TikTok from 13-year-old content up to 21-year-old content, which can include bad messaging on drugs and alcohol. So it really becomes this very comprehensive way for us to maintain privacy, but really get down into the weeds and stop the last mile availability of any of these products, services, content, and so forth.
I love this second part of the conversation, because one of the promises of cannabis legalization is that a dealer might not care who they sell to. I would argue there are some dealers who probably do care who they sell to, but the dealer doesn't regulatorily care who they sell to. But the regulated program can be the place where we ensure that all sales and all access points go to people 21 and plus. So I love hearing from you and hearing about how we can make that a reality more than a simple promise from the regulated system. So great to hear from you today, and I really appreciate the time that you took with our group. So thank you.
Absolutely, thank you, Andrew.
Lastly, as promised and previewed before, we are going to hear from Senator Hickenlooper. For those that don't know, Senator Hickenlooper was my first boss in the world of cannabis when he called me in one day and he said, you know how Colorado legalized cannabis? You're now cannabis czar. So he is a mentor and a friend and a great person, but his first thing that he said to me is what he wants to care most about is youth use. And that was the driving of success versus not success. So please bear with us for 2 seconds while we upload this video.
Hi, I'm Senator John Hickenlooper from Colorado, and I'm delighted to be with CPEAR today and talk a little bit about what Colorado's done. You know, we really did lead the way in marijuana legalization. It's been 10 years since we legalized recreational marijuana through our Amendment 64 statewide voter or citizen-driven initiative that I opposed. I didn't want Colorado to be the experiment, you know, to be the petri dish for one of the great social experiments of this century so far. And when we legalized it, and even though I opposed it, I wanted to make sure we had the best regulations we possibly could have. I was lucky to get a young Andrew Freedman. This is 10 years ago, and he worked for us for a couple of years. He was chief of staff for the lieutenant governor. Anyway, he helped put together an Amendment 64 task force where we had people from the legal side, from the public safety, the police departments around the state. We had activists who were for legalization. We had healthcare workers and doctors. We put everybody together who had an interest in this dramatic experiment. And I think we created a pretty good framework. Most of other states have either followed it or wished they followed it. Anyway, we developed a framework for an industry that previously had never been regulated. And a big focus for me was I was so nervous about kids, and by kids I mean 15, 14, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids, high school kids, that they would use more marijuana more frequently. And we luckily have a thing called the Healthy Kids Colorado Survey that is we do every 2 years. It increases. Back then when we were first doing it more than 10 years ago, it was 22,000, I think 23,000 people. Now it's up to 50,000 people. And I think we've proven and demonstrated that there is no increase in experimentation among teenagers. There is no change in frequency of use, no change in driving while high. All the things that we most worried about didn't come to pass. And we've been tracking this 30-day marijuana use among high school students every 2 years, ever since. Teenage use is flat, and we've showed that we can legalize it safely in Colorado. And I think that that's a big part of why we're looking at national efforts like CPEAR and all that you are doing. We've tied the use of the revenues to construction of schools, for programs, after school programs that drive home the fact that kids shouldn't be getting high with pot, shouldn't be drinking, and really trying to deal also with some of the unintended consequences that we get from drug use even before it was legalized. I think it's important that we tie this to criminal justice reform. There's going to be some level of equity in making sure that the communities that had been most burdened and damaged by the war on drugs get a fair shot at the opportunities for entrepreneurship. But at the same time, we're protecting youth. And again, it's an amazing thing to me. I was pretty surprised that the data overwhelmingly showed again and again that this was a situation where the data that came out was different than almost everyone expected, but it is perhaps, I think, the most compelling. It contains the most compelling reasons why we should deschedule marijuana on a national level and let states make up their own mind about how they want to go about implementing marijuana in their own states, just like we do with alcohol. So that's the step to go from where we are now to go forward. And I'm committed to, as someone who's seen the light and come around based on the new data, I'm very excited to see the potential of what's going to happen here in the months and hopefully just the months to come, but the months and maybe years to come.
Thanks for sticking with us. I thought it was an amazing conversation today. No offense meant for Senator Hickenlooper, but you also already heard from the best subject matter experts in the world on this. I think there's a few great closing thoughts here. This is clearly an issue that matters to everybody, no matter what side they stand on, being pro or anti-cannabis legalization, being pro or anti-cannabis reform, being pro or anti-medical cannabis. Everyone can agree that we need to protect our youth and think through the best ways to move into this brave new world while making sure that it is kept over the age of 21. I think you heard some great thoughts today about how that can be achieved. And I think you heard some great thoughts about how the federal government does need to play a central role in how that all gets put together. I think We have been surprised at the state level to see that this has moved in some good directions, and we need to learn from that state momentum and create a federal government framework that works to protect our youth. I thank you for today, and please reach out if you have any questions or if you want to further this conversation. Thank you.